The way is blocked. All these bombs were thrown out of school after 10th grade, no matter how tearfully their mothers begged the director with the lion's mane. Adam left home at 16, not because of school, that would have been forgiven. Lolita was the straw that broke the camel's back, the thing that wrecked everything. Eva might have softened. No one knows if she had any opinion at all. She only observed with strange detachment how her one-time bunny lover grew into a pimply willow who wore the city's strangest clothes. She did not judge her son, but neither did she care for him. The past was sewn shut with heavy cloth sheets, and everyone close to Pani Makiewicz had drifted away. That is, they were here, sure, if only she would extend her hand, but something insurmountable kept her back. Eva had a funny dream that she got pregnant again and then gave birth, which was easy, even incidental, like bringing a kitten into the world during a break between other jobs. It came out into the corner of the sofa, but she didn't quite understand whether it was a real human baby or whether it had a furry head and alert, pointy ears. The dream became even more frightening when she forgot the infant as soon as it had come out. She did bring it to her breast for a moment, but she had no milk, so she put the little lump down and it slipped her mind completely that she somehow ought to feed the newborn. The thought sometimes flickered that somewhere there was somebody helpless, someone who should give meaning to her life. But then it seemed as though that somebody had 4 legs anyway, and that it was furry and would fill its belly with mice. Adam moved in with Lolita's parents because that's where she lived, and, doubtless, they were wiser to the world, or otherwise too spineless to smoke the pair out of the house. No one just starting their life has a sure place of their own, but lives in the corners of other people's rooms, and so it has always been. There are even daughters or sons-in-law who only free themselves from their youth in their 60s. A mother-in-law can live a very long time. At the proud age of 16, Adam had no trouble making peace with any kind of room, as long as there were a couple of square metres of free floor where he could do things. Although the room at the time was a little bit horrible, with its burgundy red walls. On top of that, Lolita wore hippie clothes in combinations of only yellow and red, like she was a Tibetan monk, and when she moved around the room, it seemed like a part of her ceased to exist, because the 2 reds mixed into one, while lonely yellow flashes appeared now and again from the darkness and filled the blood-red background, only to disappear again, like the bright hands of a spirit. The girl was already 20 years old, and had finished high school with passable grades. She was now studying, on her parents' dime, at a college of education in order to become an elementary school industrial arts teacher. There was almost no competition there at all. Adam took love extraordinarily seriously. He wrote for himself pages and pages of tasks he needed to do for the good of his lady in order that she be happy and content. An example list might look like: do Lolita's school sewing assignment, give her book recommendations, take Elle to the movies, buy Elle flowers, wash the dishes, clean the room, learn massage, paint a picture of Elle, help Elle write her essay, be a nicer person, don't argue, do something nice, etc., etc. His love was a troubadour's love, of service, and when he tired of that, he disappeared to drink with his friends. Otherwise, the young man might disappear over the horizon for whole months, and they wouldn't see him once. His friends called Adam's new residence the Crypt. "Hey, anyone seen Adam?" people about town asked of Sulisław or Filek. "In the crypt," they answered glumly. Sometimes they even spat on the ground. And that was actually where he was, squatting on his heels in a free spot of floor and painting, his tongue hanging out of his mouth as he did a girl's school assignments for her. Beneath Lolita's mild demeanour was a volatile, nervous personality. Should Adam but leave the house, she might, for appearances, take too many sleeping pills or slice open her veins, or if the urge to live outweighed the urge to die, she might simply write frightful love letters that smelled of the fear of loss and of a young woman. Youth! What pain is youth! Everything in it is final, tragic, magnified, rip out the threads of your soul painful. And happiness and joy so shining, so sunny, the closeness of another's body so heavenly and powerful. You can't understand or break or tame a single feeling. Horrible. Of course, only a drained and jaded person can muse like this, one whose blood no longer crackles. Youth is strange and incomprehensible to an aged mule looking back at it, as if through a narrow well with clear water that mirrors the blue sky. May God be merciful on the innocent who are starting their lives. A young person is like a mountain goat. It must climb side first up life's sheer cliffs, up, high up, to where there is a view of the whole world, where the last salty sedge, the tastiest of all, greets them, where no other goat has climbed, where the world is angry and colourful. Young people will defeat that anger because they have the strength to wrestle. When they don't anymore, the next generation will climb on their heels, the next Lolitas and Adams. Oh, is the world not wisely made? The three musketeers were told of their expulsion from school in an especially spiteful way. Not in the spring, amid bird songs, when they got their report cards full of red. No, it was in the fall, when they yet again, slowly and reluctantly, climbed back into the schoolhouse as it ground on in eternal renovation. This heinous act probably arose out of the calculation that the nasty trio would be unable to pollute any other school with their disorder, at least for this year, and that some teachers' nerves would thus be saved. All the lists were closed, and all applications finished. 1 year of freedom awaited them, freedom without a sure place to live, without money, without a future, and without girls. Or at least, the other noble souls didn't have girls, though they tried vigorously to get them and thought of almost nothing else. This was why they held such a nasty grudge against Adam. What right did he have to build himself a petty bourgeoisie family while his friends were hard up? Suliswav bummed around without a single support in his life. He ate where food happened into his hands. Someone always had something in the pantry, and everyone knew that the moment Sul walked through the door, the pantry was the first thing he wanted to see. He quickly dug up anything edible, formed unbelievable combinations of ingredients, gorged himself full, traded a couple of words, then disappeared again to go gatecrash somewhere else. For a place to sleep, the young Zavisha got an artist's studio for drunk, or his grandmother's place, or yet another person's flat. It's entirely possible to live like a vagabond without losing, apparently at least, one's joyfulness. No one knows what impact this kind of homelessness had on his brain, because in his dreams he still longed to win the entire world for himself, like a Hunnic chief. He wanted to occupy it with his ideas and so turn it into his home. But only a non-smoker can live without a single zloty in his pocket, and all the young people, Poland's hope and future, huffed tobacco like chimneys. This is why Jerzy Niemiec landed Suliswav a job as a postman, and though this is admittedly one of the most disparaged professions in the world, it is the perfect fit for a wanderer. You walk around the city at dawn and bear the news of the world to sleeping comrades, but for the rest of the day, you're free and can lounge in bed and think big thoughts. The byproducts of all these endless journeys with a mailbag were reams of impressionistic city poetry about smokestacks and wet asphalt, defiant, elegiac, sparkling panoramas where young girls were ruined in the shadows behind bushes, the poet's dark wings scattered over the world's injustice. Even now, the warm spring rain pours down through the night, and the infamous wet asphalt, the troubadour's favourite, is full of fun, muddy puddles that cars bolt brashly through. Grey tenement blocks appear soft and hazy through the veil of rain, which trickles in gutters and carries away winter slush and waves of sopping cigarette butts. The air smells of sand, dog shit, and bitter buds. Soon, very soon, the bushes in the city's lowest layer would be the first to strike green, and in their shadow you can kiss girls and drink your first beers. There is no better way to devote yourself to your calling than to drop out of school and wander around for a year like a Hazaros, thinking about language, syllables, rhymes and rhythms, stuffing poems with an eternally youthful soul's deranged romanticism and with feelings that cut like a crystal knife. The poems roamed from hand to hand, and those lucky enough to have a typewriter printed them 10 at a time on carbon copies, which meant that the last ones were basically grey fog. Suliswav's fame grew. Warsaw's progressive young set was crazy for him. For his part, writing poetry seemed to have no social effect at all. In our world, the only tangible results are girls, fame and money. Why do so few people care for poetry? In an ideal world, everybody would write poetry. It would be the norm, and when people met on the street or in a cafe, they'd discuss Iams and Trochees and Solisvav's new verses. Niemyets and Zawisza's careers as postmen ended when they threw their carts into the bushes, because newspapers only print propaganda anyway. Speaking of which, when the spectre of the army later started to hang over the comrades' heads, every one of them managed to finagle their way out of it. In some cases, this demanded quite a bit of brains, but sometimes it was enough if you were on the list at a school or a college or something. And frequently it happened that the draft orders just didn't arrive, as if the mailmen were constantly bringing them to the wrong address, so they never made it into the right hands. Of course, a letter from the army became an eternal black cloud that spied them from a distance, and Adam did once have to go to the commission in person, but, to his great surprise, the doctor struck him off the fit list. Adam had just recently fallen off a high stone wall, had a head full of stitches, and he claimed he had a heart condition, to say nothing of his flat feet. Teofil got off because of his shit eyes, which were genuine and unfeigned. And Solisvav didn't live anywhere. In some sense, he didn't exist. The next year, Adam put himself together and registered at a night school, though this business of getting an education was still not so easy for him. He managed to stretch his studies out to 6 years, or was it longer? Because while he had the best of intentions, he couldn't manage to actually get himself to school. It was a good school in itself. He started to grasp math there, he tested out of English, and people weren't constantly making the kind of face that said, "This is a place of learning." The first couple of years were flops. Either he slept through the final exam, or he forgot the day, only to discover that evening that he'd missed the test. It wasn't the school's fault anymore, but rather the invention of the clock, or time itself, because this was a recurring phenomenon with any deadline, whether it was a visit to the dentist, someone's birthday, or a meeting of friends at the old market, all of which might slip his mind. Or it might stay there, but since he was so slow, he never made it anywhere on time in his life. Maybe some people have more ancient reptile blood in their veins. Their lives must last for centuries. Future events arise from present or maybe past ones. In early spring, Adam's family got the news that one member of the extensive Makievicz clan had passed away. It's very sad when life ends, but, as a rule, it doesn't much affect the living. This relative left behind a hovel so far away at the edge of the city that nobody wanted it, and it was in dreadful shape, total rot, full of mould, and gigantic spiders. The hut had none of the modern world's indispensable conveniences, like electricity or running water, because, in their final years, the old-timer had drifted from hospital to hospital, and no one had thought to pay the bills, which meant that all the utilities had been quietly unplugged. When they finally realised that there was this empty shack somewhere, the inheritors had to break down the door, and the picture that lay open to them wasn't uplifting. It's unclear what kind of worthless contingent this little house had once been built for. Railroad workers? But in any case, the structure was no larger than a shed, and was certainly thrown together worse. When they built it, the only material that the workmen seemed to have had in any quantity was doors, because the tiny house had the most amazing kind of dark front atrium, from which fully 6 doors led into other rooms, each the size of a matchbox. From the front door, one could step into a hall so cramped that a broad-shouldered man might get stuck there, and yet, by some trick, a staircase to the attic had also been stuffed into this atrium. After shoving the front door shut, you stood in pitch darkness. Fumbling around with your hands, it turned out that 2 doors led to the right. One of them led into the big room, in which an immense wardrobe with mirror doors covered the entire wall, while on the opposite side, a bookcase made from decaying particle board held crooked, fusty volumes on bowed, sinking shelves. The second door led to a place you might, provisionally, call a study, which was similarly floor-to-ceiling with books and had a shelf in the middle of the room like in a library. Jammed between all these stacks was a clunky desk, whose warped drawers didn't move, and whose doors hung askew on their hinges. There was a desk chair with all four legs off kilter, and its joists had even been bandaged around with strips of cloth to keep the tenons together somehow. The room's only window was filthy and divided into minuscule panes. It faced to the north, looking out at the large trees that grew around the house. Altogether, this half of the house was as dark as a cave. The door straight ahead turned a corner and led into a small room a tad lighter. A curtain scrap hung up in front of the window with a couple of nails had once been yellow, but had faded to the dull tone of a sand dune. In the corner, under the window, huddled a dank bed, and beside that was a jumbled stack of books similarly ruined by the damp, at the top of which was a cup someone had once drunk out of. There were fossilised sugar remains at the bottom. To the left, in the dark, salty hallway, were also two doors. One went to the bathroom, where lived the water lice and the spiders as big as a fist, black, furry, and with legs as thick as anchor chains. The toilet tank was broken. The last room joined the kitchen and the boiler room into one. There was a strange stove made of tin and a chest of drawers, a dish rack on top of it, and untouched dishes inside of it, these all nicely mixed with the mouse shit. In the corner stood the only piece true to the age, the fridge, and right next to the fridge was a warped trapdoor leading to the basement. When you yanked on the ring, you took some scraps of wood with you. You don't want to know what was down in the basement. The deceased's relatives shook their heads, put a new lock on the door, shared out the keys, and the house was forgotten. One mellow fall day, while Sulisław was standing at a loss on a Warsaw Avenue, having been again nudged out of some strange dwelling, a word came suddenly to his friend Adam's mind. House. At the end of the day, the house still had walls and a roof, even if there wasn't anything else there. Like a gift from heaven, a little stock of wood had survived with the house, and there were oodles of wood stacks in the surrounding yards, so they could always quietly nab a log or two from a neighbour if they were cold. The other issue was that not even Adam was keen to live in a tuberculosis incubator, so totally removed from society and its traditional comforts. That said, life at Lolita's was starting to sour. Men of such a tender age, as well as many older, fully matured man-mammoths, use a very crude tactic in such an instance. Without the courage to end their relationships like people, by speaking or negotiating or simply grabbing their stuff and going, they start to look for roundabout methods of so enraging their other half that she herself recognises that things are finished. These men start drinking and running riot and acting like pigs. Well, acting. They are pigs, mutts, weasels. Their acts are hideous and unforgivable, and no martyr's death can redeem their guilt. They can't fathom that there are women one simply cannot shake off, not even by drinking for 20 years straight. Anyway, after meeting with Sulisław, Adam ambled to his parents' house and rifled through all the drawers, lifting up all the little knickknacks on the shelves, and opened and closed the cabinet doors so slowly and methodically that his mother, Ava's patience broke. "What miracle are you looking for?" she asked, as always. Pani Mickiewicz had carried a great mishmash of food to the kitchen table in the forlorn hope that her son, who so rarely showed his face, would eat his fill. Her nourishing instinct hadn't faded, and every time her sprout paid her a visit, she emptied her cabinets of both meat and grains, and offered her son an honest sack of grub to take with him. "No one's got to go hungry," she always said, and "We don't refuse anybody a meal," or "Come, eat up now." This way, it seemed that nothing could be too wrong. "I'm looking for the house key," answered Adam, a legendary looker for things. He was always looking for something. A sock, a belt, some book, his keys, hat, his whatever, and frequently he wasn't even looking for anything. "I'm just seeing what's here," he said then. So Pani Mickiewicz didn't wonder for a moment at the search-for object, nor ask why Adam needed the key, but answered automatically, "That carved little wooden mug on the cabinet with the mirror in the front room. Look under there." She, on the other hand, was known for always knowing exactly where something was, no matter how strange or infrequently useful it might be. And if she didn't know where it was, it could count as lost. Key in hand, Adam went to the kitchen to eat, and he did indeed eat his fill. When he was hungry, he looked a bit like a tired borzoi. Sulisław Zawisza moved into the abandoned house on the first day of October, completely alone. He brought in water from the neighbour's house in a pail, and then tried, heroically, to heat the place, despite the damp, the fungus, and the decay. The structure's quirky heating system was once probably novel, almost like central heating. The stove warmed the water system, and then some kind of electric pump was supposed to move the hot water through the radiators. But there was no electricity, so after hours of heating, one corner of the radiator was tepidly warm to the touch, but the warmth receded after the second and third rib. A piteous expression appeared on Zawisza's face. He squatted in front of the stove's mouth and read mouldy books until the light faded out. The bed was like a bog. No matter how much he tried to warm the blankets and pillows by stuffing them every which way against the side of the stove, he still had the feeling that he'd wrapped himself with shrouds, all reeking of clumped, wet dirt. But, interestingly enough, the house only changed Sulisław's life in a positive way. If before it had been tough with girls, it now turned out that they really do want to pay visits. It was precisely the kind of bad, ill-intentioned girls that wanted to come drink vodka, sit in the candlelight amid the apocalypse, and feel how alive, how carefree, how relaxed they were surrounded by all that old trash. It was even romantic to sit on a rosewood sofa with springs sticking out everywhere. Well, maybe not rosewood, but chock full of carvings of roses in any case. There were heavy bronze candlesticks set all around, and the wet and the cold shrank from the warm young bodies and the candle wax. It was pleasant to imagine that the spirit of a Goethe was guarding these hideous clumps of books and drooled bulge-eyed at the damsels. In the end, Sulisław set himself up in the room in the corner with the yellow curtain scrap. There was also a yellowish wallpaper, and the low autumn sun shined in slices from the window, turning the dismal room into a blessed little golden nook. Some girls had written a sign on the door that read, "Cold, ugly room, no one wants to be here." But it was just this room, cold, ugly, the furthest from the stove, that Sulisław settled in, because all the other rooms were even more gone to shit. There were fewer things here, fewer mouldy books. He stacked the ones that were there into nice, upright piles on little improvised shelves, chucked the rest of the crap out of the room, and left the absolute minimum within. A folding table, the least wobbly chair, and the bed, and that was all. He spent all of October in his bunker. The days were still warm, and though the garden was more of a trash yard than anything else, there were still wild apples there, sunshine, and yellow autumn leaves. Sulisław lured in an off-white cat with sky-blue eyes that was loafing about, and it became his friend and companion. But the cat didn't help the fact that the sun was setting earlier and earlier, and the nights were thoroughly grim. His ascetic hermit's life was getting more and more on Sulisław's nerves. This could not continue with winter arriving. The young man could see himself lying silently in a cold, ugly room, and he saw frost on his moustache. "I'm not some lame dude," he mumbled to himself encouragingly. "Let me go rustle up the boys. With Ardy and Filek, it'll be like the Three Little Pigs." He tied up his shoes, put on a floppy overcoat over 2 sweaters, and trudged over to the bus station. In such dire need, his powers of persuasion could have coaxed anybody to live with him, even the Pope. They met in Teofil's basement. Where else? At the time, Filek was working at a land improvement trust, had his own money, and hadn't been driven out of home. Some really do look out with their parents. His stocky, bristly mustachioed father still took his son, nearly a grown man, to the zoo, and twice a month they celebrated a nice tradition they called Father's Day. Filek's father, a former sailor, also had a new family, but a Polish man doesn't simply drop his own son. Father's Day was so important that Teofil dropped everything, including his friends, who could sometimes be a bit angry at this familiarity. Filek was also a sedulous churchgoer. Some things are simply sacred. On days that weren't wholly or familial, he was the coolest chap of them all, despite his surly facade. To emphasise his proletarian background, Teofil almost always wore a marinière, heavy-laced boots, and canvas workman's pants. As time went on, his appearance was filled out with cattle chains, piercings, safety pins, and razor blades. Naturally, He was constantly getting beaten up and picked up by the cops for this. As he was a dovish creature, or even timid, he tried not to go tottering around the city too much, especially not at night and never alone. But stop. Come to think of it, he was constantly around town and constantly getting beaten up. But this didn't diminish his joyfulness for a moment. On the other hand, the home basement was, if nothing else, snug and secure. Adam squatted on his heels and reached into his bag to haul out his things. Atop the overturned wooden bin appeared a regular dark loaf of bread, a sausage link, 3 packs of cigarettes, and a bottle of Zhibrovka. As soon as each had gotten a ciggy in his face, Zavisha started. "It's like this. We have Adam's house. It's not some random place, but a one-of-a-kind, awesome house. A house with 3 rooms. Shit, how many are we? 1, 2, 3. He looked around victoriously as he declared it. Everyone gets his own room. You can't even imagine how much girls like guys with their own rooms in private houses. Kind of bourgeois, huh?" Adam uncorked the bottle and held it out to Suliswav, who took a hefty shot and then continued his rousing speech. "But, brothers, winter's coming. I've held up there for a month like some kind of fucking forest brother. And you know what I discovered one day? I have nothing to do, so I'm reading this mouldy book about the Rzeczpospolita. I'm somewhere in the Swedish deluge and I'm like, I just can't be bothered to read this shit anymore. Someone should write a completely different kind of history for Poland. So, what to do? What else was there to do? Go into the basement? Thanks, but no. So I climbed up into that accursed attic, and what do I see? A treasure hole. Those goddamn Makiewiczes have sown seeds of their golden mountains everywhere and don't care about it one bit. Adam, you know there's fucking silver up there in the attic, like in a sacristy. I haven't cracked it all open, a frightful stack of boxes, but seriously, if we sell off even a fraction of the stuff up there, we'll get the water and the electricity back." He finished and looked at Adam expectantly. Adam hummed. "This could be an eternal hassle. No one exactly knows whose the house is and who has to pay for it." Adam hated trifling property and private ownership. "Anybody can pay," Suliswav declared. "It doesn't have to be the owner. What difference does it make who goes and pays off the debts and says, 'Look, please plug the lights back in for Podrożny Avenue number 8, here's your money'? That's a wrap." Suliswav was right, of course. "I'm game," Felix said, "if only for the fun of paying Adam rent like he's a real landlord. First Monday of every month I'm going to come bow down into a hump, do a curtsy and say, 'I'd like to pay for the room, Pan. Here's your money, Pan.'" Teofil the golden-haired smirked jollily, blowing smoke out of his nostrils. His bright green mohawk looked like a tubby exotic parrot that had gotten lost in the basement. "I'll take care of all that myself," Zavisha offered. "Have Ardy do it and we'll get the electricity back for the next 5 years, before the deadline." He patted Adam contentedly on the shoulder. "You just bring your family up to speed, man. Let them know that really good young people will take care of their property and won't let it go to the dogs. Everyone knows that a house people live in stays alive. Empty houses don't have long lifespans. No one will care, believe me. They won't even look you in the eye when you tell them." It all went off swimmingly. Suliswav hopped around constantly, hauled stuff off to commission shops, paid a visit to the right bureaus, and on one very beautiful day, men in dungarees came to take the seals off the meters, and a heavenly light filled the house. The radio began to play, the lamps burned, the radiators warmed, and gratitude filled Suliswav's heart. Everything was so great. The first to move in was Filek, who set about putting the house in order with his strong workman's hands, and they ordered their little nest like the world's happiest newlyweds. The ghastliest room, the study, fell to Teofil, because the landlord, if he ever freed himself from his woman, should have the biggest room. How does one live in a room made up only of books? It isn't possible. It was even more shocking than Augeas stables, as there was no river to run through that would wash away all that knowledge. No, a punishment from the Lord. Everything had to be packed together and carried off somewhere, even a few to the attic, and they just hoped that they wouldn't rain back down through the ceiling. Nobody knows how many friends' basements these bunches of books now lounge in. Eventually there was nothing left in the room but a filthy yellow shelf, pocket calendars of naked women, and a fox pelt on the wall. The sign on the door of Felix's room said, laconically, Jim. They bought enough food to fill the refrigerator and threw the extraneous furniture out into a heap that was already collecting in the yard. Some bed frames with springs sticking out, a dubious pile of rusty metal, stacks of bricks. That is, the things that collect over the decades if they don't get buried or thrown into the woods. Even the humblest human existence pollutes the soil. The elderly relative clearly hadn't bothered to pay for a trash pickup in years and had stuffed every bit and bob that the fire didn't take into every possible crevice. Cans were carefully stacked into tin matryoshkas, one inside the other, and aluminium foil was pressed nicely flat with a fingernail and stuffed into hundreds of cigarette boxes, because foil doesn't burn. The countless glass jars full of dirt are barely worth mentioning, and there were all kinds of vinegar bottles, broken light fixtures, and odds and ends that no one knew the use for. The boys made wonderful art projects out of this dowry. Where else were they supposed to put all this debris? They hung the old lampshades on the branches of the pine growing next to the house, where they swung and jingled in the wind, while to the side of a dry trunk they nailed unknown metal objects, old shoes, and pieces of transistor radios, as a kind of technological society's totem pole, proud and imposing. Some of the objects were piled into a wall like a rampart, and at least a part of the yard was surrendered to nature. The snow soon fell and covered over the heaps, while the little house with its inhabitants went into the regime of winter and the world of ideas.